July 20th, 1969. More than 600 million people around the world watched their televisions in silence. For the first time in history, a human being was about to step onto another world. When Neil Armstrong placed his foot on the moon, it looked like a single moment of triumph. But that moment had taken more than a decade to achieve. It demanded impossible engineering, extraordinary courage, and the efforts of over 400,000 people. It began with fear. It was driven by rivalry. And it ended with one of humanity's greatest achievements. This is the story of how NASA put humans on the moon. October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. It wasn't much bigger than a beach ball. It carried no astronauts. It fired no weapons. Yet its tiny radio signal echoed around the planet, sending a powerful message. The space age had begun. For many Americans, Sputnik was more than a scientific breakthrough. It was a national shock. If the Soviet Union could launch a satellite into orbit, it might also be capable of launching missiles across continents. The United States suddenly found itself falling behind. Something had to change. Within a year, America created a new organization with one ambitious mission. Its name was NASA. And before long, it would be given the most impossible challenge in human history. Sputnik changed everything. The United States realized it could no longer treat space as a scientific curiosity. It had become a matter of national security, technological leadership, and national pride. On July 29, 1958, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act. Just a few months later, NASA officially opened its doors. It inherited old research facilities, a handful of scientists, and a mission unlike anything the world had ever attempted. At first, NASA wasn't thinking about landing on the moon. Its first goal was much simpler. Could a human survive in space? No one knew. No one had ever left Earth's atmosphere and returned safely. Before astronauts could dream of walking on the moon, they first had to prove they could stay alive beyond our planet. NASA had an organization now, but an organization was not enough. It needed astronauts. And in 1959, 7 men were selected for a mission that had never been attempted by an American. They were military test pilots, chosen because they were accustomed to flying machines that pushed the limits of what was considered possible. But spaceflight was different. A fighter pilot could control an aircraft. An astronaut would be sealed inside a tiny capsule, traveling thousands of miles per hour, with almost no room to react if something went wrong. The Mercury program was designed to answer one question. Could a human being survive spaceflight? The first attempts were uncrewed. Then, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard climbed into Freedom 7. Minutes later, a Redstone rocket lifted him away from Earth. He spent only about 15 minutes in space. But those 15 minutes changed America's confidence. For the first time, an American had reached space and returned safely. NASA had learned something even more important. Humans could survive the journey. Now the question was, how much farther could they go? In May 1961, America had barely managed to send one man into space. Then President John F. Kennedy made an extraordinary announcement. The United States would send a man to the moon and bring him safely back to Earth before the decade was over. The goal sounded almost impossible. America didn't yet have the rocket, It didn't have the spacecraft. It didn't know exactly how astronauts would land on the moon, or even how they would return. But Kennedy wasn't asking NASA to wait until all the answers were known. He was giving them a deadline: less than 8 years. That decision transformed the space program overnight. NASA would now have to solve problems that had never been solved before. It needed a rocket powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity, a spacecraft capable of carrying astronauts hundreds of thousands of miles, and a way to land on the moon, then launch back into space. The race was no longer about reaching space. The destination was the moon. Kennedy had given NASA a deadline, but there was a problem. NASA still didn't know how to get astronauts to the moon. Before attempting the journey, they needed to learn how to operate in space for days at a time. That was the purpose of Project Gemini. The spacecraft carried 2 astronauts instead of 1. They would test longer missions, spacewalks, orbital maneuvers, and something that would become absolutely critical: docking 2 spacecraft together in orbit. Every successful mission gave NASA another piece of the puzzle. But the closer America came to the moon, the more dangerous the program became. NASA was moving faster than ever, and eventually, the risks would catch up with them. By 1967, NASA had made enormous progress. The moon no longer seemed like an impossible dream. Apollo was designed to take astronauts farther than anyone had ever gone. But before the first Apollo mission could even leave the launch pad, tragedy struck. On January 27th, 3 astronauts entered the Apollo 1 spacecraft for a routine ground test: Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. They were preparing for a mission that would never happen. Inside the capsule, a fire suddenly erupted. The pure oxygen environment allowed the flames to spread with terrifying speed. The astronauts were trapped. Within seconds, the spacecraft was engulfed. All 3 men died. For NASA, the shock was enormous. The moon landing was suddenly no longer just an engineering challenge. It was a question of whether the program could continue at all. NASA stopped. Investigators began examining every part of the spacecraft. The design was changed. Safety procedures were rewritten, and the pressure to reach the moon became even greater. NASA had lost 3 men. Now it had to make sure their sacrifice would not be in vain. The Apollo program had survived its darkest moment. Now NASA had to prove that the redesigned spacecraft could actually carry astronauts safely toward the moon. In December 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed mission to leave Earth orbit. Its destination was the moon. Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders were about to travel farther from Earth than any humans before them. For 3 days, they crossed the enormous distance between the 2 worlds. Then the spacecraft disappeared behind the moon. For a few minutes, NASA could no longer communicate with the crew. If the engine failed to fire at the right moment, the astronauts might never come home. Then Apollo 8 emerged from the far side. The mission had worked. And for the first time, human beings saw the Earth rising above the lunar horizon. The moon was no longer just a distant object in the sky. NASA had reached it. But landing there was still an entirely different challenge. Apollo 8 had proved that humans could reach the moon. But reaching the moon was only half the problem. NASA still had to learn how to land there. That meant testing the lunar module, a strange-looking spacecraft designed to separate from the main Apollo vehicle, carry 2 astronauts down to the lunar surface, and then launch them back into orbit. In March 1969, Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Astronauts practiced separating the two spacecraft, flying independently and reconnecting them again. Everything had to work perfectly. Then came Apollo 10. This time, NASA took the entire system to the moon. The lunar module descended to just a few miles above the lunar surface. The astronauts could see exactly where future explorers would land, but they stopped short. Apollo 10 was the final rehearsal. The hardware had been tested. The procedures had been practiced. The astronauts were ready. There was only one mission left. Apollo 11. July 16, 1969. The Saturn V stood on its launch pad, carrying the hopes of an entire nation. Inside the spacecraft were three astronauts: Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Below them, hundreds of thousands of people had gathered to watch. Millions more were following the launch around the world. Then the engines ignited. The most powerful rocket ever built began to rise. Apollo 11 was finally on its way to the moon. For 3 days, the astronauts traveled through deep space. Earth slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead was the moon, but reaching it was only the beginning. Armstrong and Aldrin would have to separate from the command module, descend toward the lunar surface, and somehow land safely. If anything went wrong, there would be no rescue mission. They were about to find out whether 10 years of preparation had been enough. The moon landing was over. But NASA's greatest achievement was not the footprint Armstrong left behind. It was everything that had been built to make that footprint possible. New rockets, new computers, new materials, new ways of communicating, new ways of solving problems that had never existed before. And the strange thing is, Apollo did not end when the astronauts returned to Earth. Its technology, its discoveries, and its way of thinking continued spreading into the world around us. But there was another question waiting. If America could spend billions to reach the moon, what happened when the money stopped flowing? And what did NASA do next? Because the story of the moon landing was only the beginning. This is Earn, Spin, Invest.